Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. I'm the CEO of Greystoke Investments and Greystoke Networks, a media company, and I run a charity called Child Rescue Association. And this is our first episode of a new mini-series I'm doing with my good friend Ted Myers, CEO of Principles Media, spent 32 years at Bloomberg. And Ted, why don't you tell people a little bit of the highlights of your time at Bloomberg before we get on to our guest this week?
Sure. So I spent 3 decades at Bloomberg, which seems incredible. Just briefly, I spent half of that time in the editorial group. I was the 15th person hired by Bloomberg News and spent 16 years editing, writing, managing groups of people. And then I moved into the product division and I oversaw the building of applications on the Bloomberg Professional Service. And I left a year ago to start my own company called Principles Media. And we do ghostwriting for executives and also writing of thought leadership and other topics. I'm a big proponent of writing online as a way to build your brand and your visibility.
Yeah. And just because it's so relevant to the conversation, let's talk about this time on the content side of Bloomberg. You weren't just a journalist, rose to the bureau chief for the
Yeah,
tell us the levels.
I started out as a journalist. I was covering emerging markets back before they were called emerging markets in the early 90s. And then eventually I became a bureau chief in New York and eventually managing editor for the Americas. So, ran all the coverage from Canada to Chile, focused on, markets, companies, politics, and everything else. So, it was a lot. It was a great experience, and it was just a fantastic preparation. Also to then go and build applications based on it.
Well, and it's funny how this mini-series started because you and I found each other one of us would end up calling each other basically every Friday afternoon and talking about what CEOs are doing online. You grew 20,000 followers on LinkedIn this year, and we're both so interested in that. You're like, hey, should we just record these?
Yeah.
And then as we got into that, you're like, in fact, as much fun as it is to talk to each other, let's get even more fun people to talk to. And I was like, who'd be amazing? My friend Shane Snow. He's incredible. Best-selling author, built a $100 million tech company called Contently, has 400,000 plus followers on LinkedIn, has an amazing new company called Showrunner that just won Product of the Year at NAB. If you don't know that, that's like the Olympics for new camera gear and stuff.
Okay.
And I called him yesterday. I was like, hey, you want to be on the show? He's like, okay. I was like, do you want to be on the show tomorrow? He's like, let me move some things around. So Shane Snow, thank you for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. And no, I was excited to come on with you guys and to meet Ted. And, I've heard so much about him from you, Jess. And I've been to Bloomberg a time or two and seen how amazing of an operation they have there. And as, I got my career started in journalism, and walking into a place like that where everything down to even the building design, everything is made out of glass because transparency and news is all, everything is so thoughtfully done. And just knowing what a veteran of that organization Ted is, how could I say no? So yeah, during the lunch break, during a film shoot today, I'm here to talk to you guys and learn with you.
We're glad you took time away from the Navy SEAL guy that you guys are filming today to come do this with us. And so let's cover a couple of career highlights that I missed. I missed, writing for Wired and Fast Company and the New Yorker and Forbes and things like this that you've done. What else did I miss in my brief overview on your background?
I think that's pretty good. You're, skipping over all the things that I tried that didn't work. And, all of the inevitable, failure that you turn into feedback, along the way. But no, I have bounced between being an entrepreneur and being a writer, since I started my career. And I mean, even since high school, really, when I told my parents I wanted to be a writer, but I started doing, internet business in the late 90s. And I think having lived in both of those worlds, and, I went from journalism to writing books and then to writing for entertainment. And that has, I think, been really fun, but also has been part of, I guess, my philosophy in general for careers and for business, is that going deep into different areas helps you to kind of import things into whatever field you're working in that not necessarily everyone else who's in that lane and has been sort of deep in that field the whole time. You're bringing new stuff to the table, and so that's been my philosophy. And Yeah, that's I'd say that's the highlights. Lately, I have gotten pulled into uh, producing Broadway shows. So I've got a couple of co-producing a couple of shows this season that are opening, and so that's kind of the latest adventure is diving into storytelling in that world, and producing. Is often a fancy word for helping raise money, and then getting to meet amazing people and helping to put together some good stories and packages. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
in
it's
a
incredible.
nutshell.
Well, and I try not to get through any conversations with either of you without recommending at least a book. And so Shane's got a great book on storytelling, and his book Dream Teams is amazing. But I have read his book Smart Cuts like over and over and over. And anybody who doesn't have a copy of that needs to go on audible.com and buy it. It was like the password to my computer to like help me remember Smart Cuts. So Ted, if you haven't read this one, it's about this idea of skipping unnecessary work. And that when you skip unnecessary work that hurts others, that's a shortcut. But when you skip unnecessary work that doesn't hurt others, that's a smart cut. And it's like all this research of how like presidents of the United States become a president before most people can become a senator. And like, David Helmer Hansen, who from 37 Signals, how he like skipped leagues in race car driving and just creating Ruby on Rails. And anyways, epic book for any entrepreneur, anybody trying to make anything.
Thank you. That's so flattering.
I've done a bit of the blabbing here. Oh, let's start quick. We got to talk about Showrunner. This is amazing. Anybody who's seen The Mandalorian and like watched Industrial Light and Magic try to like match how the LED wall in the back has the right lighting and color with the actors from The Mandalorian, and like watch these specials like I did, thought that stuff is like magic, and it is. And then I'm talking to Shane. He's like, oh yeah, my partners and I figured out how to use the Unreal video game engine from like Fortnite, and we made it so mere mortals can actually make movies like that, and obviously did so well. Won NAB Product of the Year this year. But Shane, give us a little bit of background on Showrunner.
Sure. Well, yeah. So the general idea is if you want to make a movie or a TV show, you either got to go out in the world and shoot on location, and that's fun, but you have to shut down streets, you have to move people, you have to set up a base camp. It's very expensive. And if you want to move from one location to another, that costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. You can't shoot very much if you're bouncing around. That's why movies take forever, cost a lot of money. And the other option you have is to go into a studio and build a set, make it look like you're in one of those locations, and that takes time to build and to tear down and to rebuild. And so this new trend of virtual production is essentially the best of both worlds. You get to sit in a studio, but the world or the set is a virtual background projected on LED walls. So it's rooms made out of LED walls, and then you bring in furniture and decorations and layers of real objects, and you have your actors in 1 minute they're in the desert, and another minute they're in a coffee shop, another minute they're on the moon. And so we what Showrunner does is we build technology that makes it easy to operate that kind of crazy fancy holodeck from Star Trek kind of film studio.
How widespread is that
stuff.
now? How many companies use that? Or it certainly sounds like the future. It's got to be. It's what people are going to be doing all over the place, right?
It's so The Mandalorian is the example that everyone kind of clued everyone in the film world into this technology. Super expensive, one of the most expensive shows on television, but it's cheaper than a whole Star Wars movie for them to make an hour or two of The Mandalorian. So everyone knows about it. A lot of studios have been popping up, building LED walls, or there's already been studios that have, some of this technology. The thing that is preventing it from being super widespread is that it's just very technically difficult. And so that's the area where we play is the great director and their, cinematographer walk into a studio and they're like, wow, the LED walls, and this is amazing. I don't know how to do this. Let's just go on location, even though it costs more. Technology making that easier is the thing that's going to help lower that barrier entry. So short answer is more and more of it is happening, and hopefully more soon. And we're trying to be part of that.
So I want to kick things off here. Ted and I are slightly obsessed with how, especially LinkedIn is changing the world. Like I'm a major like YouTube for CEOs guy, but especially LinkedIn. Like we're texting and talking about this like all week, every week it seems like he and I. And you have accomplished what so many others haven't. Do you know how many followers you have on LinkedIn, Shane?
It's somewhere around 400,000 followers, and then I have a couple 100,000 LinkedIn newsletter subscribers, which I actually think are worth a little bit more of their weight than regular followers because you're getting access to their email as well.
Okay. Well, Ted, I'm going to hand it off to you. What do you want to Shane first?
I want to know, maybe give us a little bit of your sense of your strategy for posting. Maybe why you started posting to begin with, like what were you thinking you'd accomplish, and a little bit about how you do it, like what works, what you've seen work well.
Yeah, so I started off, early when LinkedIn used to be just purely, a social network, almost like your resume, and then you connect with people, right? And then it started turning into this platform for sharing content. And early on in that phase, when they started letting people post articles and, longer updates, in their news feed, I started basically writing my blog on LinkedIn. So things that I was writing about already on my own, WordPress site, I started just doing on LinkedIn. And at that time, it was a little bit more novel for people to be writing like really in-depth stuff, basically. So I was mostly taking things that were, newsworthy topics that I had to take on and writing, 1,000 words on it and putting it on LinkedIn. And that I think is what drove a lot of my followership early on. Now a lot of people do that, right? Like it's pretty common now. LinkedIn has evolved into being this place where people really do go for content now, as much or more than just to connect with people. But what the LinkedIn editorial team says, and I'm lucky enough to get to actually work with them and get some inside scoops on things from them when new features come out. I get access to them often early, and then that would be, I would say, the big secret is when a new feature comes out, jumping on that early helps you grow a lot because LinkedIn will promote, so when newsletters came out, being an early newsletter adopter, they would promote, you as a creator. When LinkedIn video came out, they promoted that more. I'll say though, LinkedIn is much more of a reader platform than a video platform. And nowadays I'd say that's directly out of the LinkedIn team's mouth, really, that they see video on there and they've tried to promote video a lot, and you can still post video, but people are just user behavior on LinkedIn. People are there to read.
Do you think that's the demographic, or do you think that's, the platform, or like why is that? Because we've definitely seen a move from text to video in general, right? I mean, in general, and I see more video on LinkedIn than I used to.
I would say, I could be wrong about this, but I would say it's because the actual interface of LinkedIn is you are scrolling for content. You're looking for nuggets, right? For tidbits. And to stop and watch a video kind of breaks that scroll. And it's a little bit different. There are, like TikTok and Reddit where videos will autoplay, and it's easier to do that, on mobile. But I think that's part of it is LinkedIn is just built more for scanning rather than stopping your flow. But I think you're right that part of it is an audience thing. A large percentage of LinkedIn are busy professionals who I would say would rather speed read something than kind of wait for the video timer. It's not entertainment they're looking for. They're looking for tidbits of value.
So what do you think that they're looking for to read? I mean, just from your personal experience, what you thought, and maybe what you see being read. Like, what do you read most on LinkedIn? What do you think's trending?
Yeah, I'm big into this concept, and this actually I wrote about in my book Smart Cuts. Big into this concept of getting mentorship from people who have no idea that you consider them your mentor.
Oh, I love that. Okay,
a lot of that
I love that. So you can be a lurking mentor, a mentee, but
yes,
but I don't know that. You don't know that. Okay.
Yeah, and some of the greatest minds in the world, in any profession, right, are on LinkedIn sharing their nuggets of wisdom, and so following those people to learn how they think can feel like mentorship. And you might comment on their post and they never comment back, but you might comment on their post and they do comment back, and that feels like there's a relationship there, but it's different than kind of the entertainment factor of following people on, Instagram. You're actually trying to learn the secrets of these people who are masters in their field. So for me, that's what a lot of what drives kind of my LinkedIn behavior is. I want to know, what the CEO of Hootsuite thinks about things. I want to know what Richard Branson, how he thinks, and when I'm solving problems, I want to think about like how would these people kind of solve these same kinds of problems. And I think for us mortals who aren't necessarily those kind of iconic business characters, providing our own nuggets of wisdom can also serve that purpose for other people. And you don't know who is catching wind of your stuff and then considering you to be a mentor from afar, which I would say is I'll get messages sometimes from people almost coming out and saying that, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because like I'm not really that big a deal compared to other people that are on here, but something that I'm saying is helping them kind of want to follow in the footsteps I'm in, and that kind of reciprocal, I'm learning from others and I'm sharing with others and they're learning from me. I think that's a lot of what drives LinkedIn.
That's interesting, because I think that it does lower the bar on who's, as you said, a big deal. Like, so more people can be a big deal. That's one thing. But I also think it somewhat democratizes it in the sense that if you have some interesting things to share, really high quality, really thoughtful, people are going to get information out of that and get insight and get benefit, even if your title is not huge or you're not regarded as kind of a significant person in the traditional way that would occur. In like meaning your title or your job or your position or company or what have you. I think that's interesting. It opens up that opportunity for more people, in a way, I guess, to be influencers on the one side, and for people to learn from more people. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and there's also, as much as it pays to learn from the greatest in the world, you can also learn a lot of very nuanced things from people who are not famous, right? And I think that's part of it. And and things that do well will tend to go more viral, than other places, because it's so professionally focused. I'll also say that for me, I love getting caught by, in my LinkedIn feed, by someone who's sharing a personal story about like a pivot or a counterintuitive lesson that they've learned, and it doesn't matter who they are. Like the surprising thing I learned when I did this thing, right or wrong or whatever, like those kinds of things. I don't know where else you would find those kinds of stories. You got to read a whole book, and so that I think can be pretty fantastic.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think you're right. I mean, I experience this. The basic thing about LinkedIn is people like stories that say, this is what I did and this is what I learned. That's a great formula for people if you're not sure where to begin. Then you also mentioned the personal element. And I think a lot of people are confused about what personal means and is, and there's a good kind of personal and maybe bad kind of personal. Like, what do you find works for you either what works for you or what do you like to read that's personal?
Yeah, in thinking about, what stands out the most, I think a lot of it is, and maybe I'm just drawn to these kinds of people, but stories of where you were wrong and what you learned about it. I mean, it's a good way to, certainly get people's attention. Like, here's where I went wrong and here's what I learned. And, it doesn't have to be personal and like this was happening in my personal life, but it's vulnerable to share things like that, like we screwed up or I screwed up, or I thought that I was right about this and then I wasn't. That kind of stuff can be inspiring. And I think you relate to it because none of us are perfect. And so much of social media kind of is built around this, like, appear perfect so that more people follow you and like your photos and all of that. And so that I'm drawn to in particular. The advice that LinkedIn themselves give about what kind of content tends to work best for getting engagement, people actually commenting or resharing. There's actually 5 of kind of a framework of 5 categories that they talk about. One is advice, management, career, or leadership advice based on things that you've been through or people you look up to. And so you see a lot of like, my employee did this and this is why it was awesome. Or, early in my career, I did this and this is what I learned. It's kind of advice that's not like philosophical or, just like quotations or whatever. It's advice rooted in some real person doing something that other people could relate to. And then the other categories are, explaining trends, and especially if you have a personal twist or take on this trend, like this thing is happening here right now. Everyone's talking about AI. AI stuff is happening, but here is a specific story of what's going on with me or my company or someone that I know. And the same thing with like news, things that are in the culture, trends being kind of business trends, or news things being like, I don't know, whatever's going on in the news right now. Like it's the Olympics, and here's a thing that I have learned or that I'm thinking about based on, this event that I saw. So it doesn't have to be about you to be personal, if that makes sense. It's your personal lens on these sort of human stories. And then the other 2 categories, one I love, one is just sharing news about your company, which I think only does well if something's really surprising. But taking people behind the scenes in something you're doing, and in particular your unique way of doing things, like that tends to be really powerful. Like here's the story behind the story that you've seen, and this is where I think visuals can help a lot. Here's the photo of us that you don't see. You see the glossy in front of the camera. Here's us behind the camera, what's going on. That kind of stuff I think is a way to personalize or at least humanize, not necessarily digging into like, Ed, here's photos of my kids and here's like what's going on in my personal life. That the personal element is that human story part of it, if that makes sense.
Right. I think that makes sense. Do you find you get a lot of direct messages, but what's the flow on that of what things you post and what kind of engagement, what do you publish that gets the most engagement?
So direct messages, I go through spurts, and I'm a little sheepish about it. There will be times when I'm posting every day for weeks and weeks and weeks, and there will be times where I post once a month. And I get the most messages when I'm posting the most, but often if I'm not posting a lot and I'm getting messages, it's either someone has seen some old thing of mine and they're like, oh my gosh, I read this thing from 2016. And I can't believe I just, discovered your content. Those are always nice. And that's part of what's great, about a platform like LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn is you have a backlog of content that's all professional content. It's all, they're not looking at Halloween photos, in between stuff. It's all stuff that could be relevant to what some people are on LinkedIn for. But if I'm not posting much, it's either that or it's, hey, do you want to buy this thing? There's a lot of selling that goes on in my direct messages. When I'm posting a lot, it's usually people saying thank you,
okay.
and wanting to start a conversation. Which is cool.
Do you ever buy anything?
No.
No.
I have, if it's something that I'm actually looking for, there's been a couple of times where it's like, hey, do you need sales consulting? And it's like, actually, we just hired a new sales leader, so like maybe I'll pass this referral on. But it's got to be like, usually they don't know that this is actually something that's relevant. Usually it's it's not something I'm buying at all.
So
yeah,
Ted and I are talking about posting a lot. We're text messaging, we're sending each other, oh, did you see this? Right. And really, especially around this, like the CEO who wants to get a bunch of extra attention so they can point it at their company. Because, so often it's easier to get attention for a human than for a logo, right?
Yeah.
So those CEOs who are willing to wave the flag and be the face of the company and get people interested in them and then point that at the business, right? But I would love to hear about your newsletter strategy. I mean, there's so many people that would love to get a couple 100,000 people signed up for the newsletter. What do you do different there? How do you think about that differently? What advice would you have if you were starting over today?
Yeah. So originally my newsletter strategy was just the blog posts that I would be putting on LinkedIn. I'm now just doing them in a newsletter. And so, there's a theme. People subscribe because they're interested in a subtopic of all the topics I write about. So I actually have a couple of newsletters, One is about innovation and problem solving, and then I have another one about storytelling, and sometimes they overlap. But how the strategy has evolved is kind of based on what I've seen do the best, which is series. I'll sign up for a newsletter if it's like, hey, there's going to be 5 emails about this topic. Sign up for the newsletter. This is part of a series, or it almost like a email course kind of concept that has worked really well for getting people to subscribe. And so it'll be like, hey, I'm doing an 8-part series on XYZ. And then every newsletter post this is post number 2 of the 8-part series on XYZ. And then you get a bunch of shares and subscribers because people are specifically interested in this event, essentially, that you're creating with the newsletter.
And how does that work on LinkedIn?
That, I would say, works the best.
Sorry to interrupt. How does that work on LinkedIn with the email and the back and forth and explain some of the logistics for CEOs listening today who aren't aware of that?
Yeah. So what it is when you go to post an article, so, you log into LinkedIn and there's that small box that looks like Twitter or whatever. And it's like write a post or post a photo or post a poll. And then there's a button around there that says, or write an article. If you click on write an article, then you can write a regular article. And it's basically that post with the small, Twitter-sized nugget of wisdom is you write one of those, but then it links to an article that is like a blog post that links on LinkedIn. But when you're on the article page and you're writing that article, you can select from a dropdown, make this a newsletter. And you have to set up, one or more newsletters, but I'll write an article, essentially a blog post, and then I'll select send this to my innovation and lateral thinking newsletter. And all it does is when you hit publish, that article gets sent in an email to everyone that has subscribed to that newsletter. And the little blurb that you write for the LinkedIn post, the Twitter-sized post, that goes in your LinkedIn feed, and then people just get in their inbox like, Shane Snow just wrote this article, and here's the whole article in your inbox, and that's it. And then in those newsletter articles, I will at the top and bottom of the post basically promote the whatever else it is I'm promoting, like the larger newsletter, or because people, what they often do is they'll get this newsletter and then they'll forward it to other people. So you'll get a forward that's like, oh, hey, here's this thing that I thought you might want to read. You read it in your email, and then it says, hey, subscribe to the rest of this newsletter, or subscribe to the other articles in this series. And and it's a pretty great way to build that newsletter following.
And what would be your advice for busy CEOs who are thinking about carving out the time for this? It's a real sacrifice. Maybe there's some trepidation about it. They only want to do if it's going to work. There's no guarantees in life. What kind of advice for CEOs?
Yeah. I mean, I would say if that list that you just said, is true, and you are busy and you want to make sure that the time you take on this is going to pay off. And one of the things about creating content and doing thought leadership is you do need to do a lot. You can't just throw one thing out there and then expect to just have lots of people following you. There needs to be some, whether it's totally consistent or not, there needs to be some amount of volume. So you do need to invest time into it. I would say hiring someone, if you have an assistant or a chief of staff or a marketing person or a consultant or an agency that can sit down with you, even virtually, and take the nuggets of wisdom that you have and turn those into sort of bigger posts, like flesh them out. I would say a half-hour a week on the phone or on Zoom with essentially a ghostwriter to have them pick your brain on some of these things, conversations you've had recently where there's, interesting insights or advice, people who you've learned from recently, what's the story behind it, but take us behind the scenes of things that have been going on. Having someone who is almost doing this journalistic effort to kind of extract from you what you have that is unique that you can offer the world, and then take the time to turn that into the longer content, and then you should read it and approve it and edit it and all of that. I think that's totally valid, and I think that's what a lot of CEOs do. The ideas aren't coming from the ghostwriter, but the time it takes to really sit down and write it out and edit it, you can have someone who's skilled at that do that, and you provide the thoughts for that thought leadership.
I'm laughing here. This is literally what Ted's company principles does.
Oh,
Ted has a bunch of journalists from like Washington Post, New York Times, Bloomberg and stuff that work for him. That's literally what he does.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting,
I did not know that, by the way.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Sorry, go.
But I think one thing that's interesting from my perspective, hearing that from you, is I do think it's sometimes hard for people to know what their own story is. So the role of people might say, I think people say, well, why would I need somebody to write something for me? Because I can write, but it's sometimes hard to know what your own story is and how it will be viewed. So I think a third party provides a little bit of that. I compare it a little bit to going to the gym. Anyone can go to the gym and work out. A lot of people also get a trainer when they go to the gym because it ensures you're going to go to the gym and your workout's a little more effective. So I think that's part of it. It's just a more effective process in doing so.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the trainer analogy is great because they make sure that you stay on track. There's some accountability for you to not skip this week and then skip next week, and you're going to keep going. But they also can zero in on what uniquely you should be working on. And I think like a journalism-based approach, and a journalist or an editor who their job, if they're not interviewing you as a CEO, would be to go out and find where the real story is in this bigger picture thing. They go and they interview people and they zero in on, tell me more about that. Because that's the thing that the audience is going to want to hear about, and they can connect the dots. And you as a leader might be this font of wisdom and knowledge, but yeah, it's like, all right, give us some wisdom. Like, where do I start? Someone who can kind of zero in and get that from you, I think is fantastic.
The other thing you mentioned, though, and I think this is important for people to understand, is that you said you could spend a half an hour talking to somebody, and then they can help you write it, kind of like the trainer analogy. But I think a lot of people in the old model assumed you could just hire somebody to go do it without any participation. And I think that's what I see, where if you don't participate at all, it's clear in the writing and the content and the style and everything that like you had no engagement, you had no involvement. People just don't look at it. They don't see it as authentic, and they don't see it as you. And then it kind of defeats the purpose of even showing up. And so I think you highlighted something there that you have to be involved. You have to be involved. It has to be your story, even if someone's helping you tell that story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's why would you, I guess this is the way that I would look at it is something interesting that you would read on LinkedIn. Why would you hit the follow button to read more from that person? If they post something that anyone could have posted, you're not going to hit that follow button. If they post something that you can tell there's more where this came from that's unique, that's when you're going to hit that follow button.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. But you know what I mean? And I'd be curious of your thoughts about thought leadership, because I think thought leadership in the past oftentimes is done in a way where people say, I want to be viewed as an environmentalist. And the assignment to the writer is go write something that makes me look like an environmentalist, but there's not a lot of direct engagement. And a lot of thought leadership is like outsourced that way. And I think from what I see is that maybe worked at some point, but it's less and less effective. And people can read that you weren't involved. They can see you're not really an environmentalist. And what they're looking for is that they're looking for that story where it's clear you are in the story. You're personally involved, you're engaged, you have some element where you're talking about. And I noticed this in your writing. You will write about things, but when you wrote about Showrunner, you're writing about the show. It's clearly not only is it something you work on, but you clearly were telling stories that you learned from, lessons you learned from doing that project, right? And it's not generic. It feels very specific, but also accessible. I think that's sort of what I see as the kind of the magic is you're writing about your experience, but in a way that people can also learn from.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a nice compliment. I a couple of years ago, I think it's hard. Time is weird post pandemic. I think it was during the pandemic. I don't know. like those years kind of are hard to look back on and remember correctly. But I was asked by Lenovo, the computer brand, to do some posts on LinkedIn about this new line of laptops that they have. And I haven't really done a lot of that sort of thing, this sort of sponsored post thing myself, because it's always felt kind of weird. And what worked about it, and those posts did super well. I did 3 or 4 of them where the way that it had to work for me to make it make sense, and the reason I think this post got tons and tons of views, is I took their laptops. They sent me these 3 laptops, and then I went and I used them, and I was traveling around the world, and I took photos of me using them in these places, and actually figured out how can this thing that I'm supposed to promote be more than me just holding something up in front of a photo. What are the pros and cons of using this product? And then I boiled that back to, or connected the dots from kind of what that experience was to kind of larger leadership lessons and patterns that I wanted to talk about. And so I don't know if it was, I think some brand marketer could have been like, we would like someone with a lot of followers to list out the bullets of why our laptops are great. And what they got was me on an airplane using this laptop and pontificating about how we, work when we are, working from, the middle seat. And,
but that's a good,
and it was personal.
I want you to say more about that, because my perspective is that old school is very directly promotional, and that just doesn't work anymore. Like if you directly say Lenovo is awesome, people are not receptive to that message. It might even be harmful to post that. You get 0 engagement, So you're right. I mean, it's actually talking about what you're doing or what you're thinking with, using the product is one thing. But if it's seen as a commercial in a direct way like that, it just doesn't work. And the same is true for people, I believe.
Yeah, I bring it up because it's an example of what should be the hardest thing to get people to care about, right? Me talking about some laptop, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just pulling it up now just while we're here. One of the posts, just a random post of that series, how technology should empower work style diversity, a personal case study. And, part of this laptop series was they had these different types of laptops where it's like, pick which one you want, the one where you fold it in half, or one where you use it with a stylus and all that. And I used it as an excuse to talk about how, hey, we're in the middle of this new era where half of us are working from home and some of us are working from closets, and we've moved back home and we've got kids running around in the background of these Zoom calls. We need to account for the fact that everyone's work style and work situation is different, and they're going to get their best work done in different situations, and we got to account for all these other distractions. And so what technology you decide to buy to support your work should reflect the fact that we're all different. Don't just buy everyone the same set of gear. And that's, again, probably not what they had in mind, but that's why, hundreds of people commented on that post. Yeah.
Just for the record, I'm working on a Lenovo right now, just in case they're listening.
Nice.
So
cool.
But I'm curious, as you read other, so we're very interested in like executive CEOs writing. The reality is very few do that right now. And if you look at the S&P 500, I think 80% don't have a social presence that is identifiable as them. Okay, they may have a social presence, but they don't have Twitter or LinkedIn or what have you. The 20% that do, probably a significant amount of those are so outsourced as to be, they're not really kind of the personal stories we're talking about.
Right.
But who do you, if there's any people you see as models, whether it's a big company, small company, kind of who do you see writing, who writes effectively, and why do you think they're effective?
Yeah. So the couple that jump out to me right away, I actually have a list that I should actually share with you guys. I don't know if you want to bother putting them in the show notes, but I have a list of people who I think are great examples that when I'm stuck, I'll just read their posts.
Okay.
But who jumps to mind is the very first, I think person who just really was so popular on LinkedIn was Richard Branson. I think Bill Gates also, but Richard Branson was the one that everyone was reading his stuff. And it was a mix of, kind of like advice. He does a lot of leadership advice, but it was a mix of that. And here I am behind the scenes at this event where we're launching the, whatever the announcement for this new thing for my space company. And here's the cocktail that they made with it's a space themed cocktail with there's smoke coming out of it. And here I am backstage with these interesting people. And this is why this is important to me and why you should dream big too. And so it's kind of this access to this interesting kind of side of a celebrity business person. That type of stuff is great. If you're not living that kind of life as a leader, it's harder to make that exciting of a post. But inside of your industry, there's the version of that. I'm backstage before I'm about to go on this panel. And guess what? Even though I run a company of, 1,000 people, I'm nervous because I'm on stage with these people who you may not have heard of, but they're awesome. And here's what they have to say. That kind of stuff is great. A person who immediately came to mind when you asked that question, in part because I'm close to him. He's co-author of one of my books and one of my best friends, Joe Laser. He's the head of marketing for a company called A-Team. And instead of what you would imagine a head of marketing would do on LinkedIn and just promoting A-Team all the time, he writes these LinkedIn newsletters about A-Team. They do basically recruiting. They help you hire a team of, of developers and designers to build your app or your product. And they do a lot of stuff with developing AI apps. But he'll write these newsletters, like one recently where he's like, I fell in love with Kurt Vonnegut when I was 7 years old. And that's a weird thing for a 7-year-old to love. But here's all the stuff about Kurt Vonnegut of why I was a nerd when I was a kid and was really into this writer that should have been too old for me to get into. And here's how I think of my job as a marketing leader today in light of my childhood love for Kurt Vonnegut. And it's fantastic stuff. That post, I'm pretty sure did well, but all of his posts are like that, of digging into his past for something that's either quirky or unique or fascinating, and then tying it into some trend that's going on. And yeah, a lot of his stuff is about AI because they help people, find programmers to develop AI apps. But it feels really authentic, and it manages to be entertaining, even though on paper it should be the least entertaining topic that he's promoting. Programmers to build apps in a B2B setting, and I'm the marketing guy for it. So he's one that I would definitely look at. You could say he almost overdoes how much love and personal kind of attention he puts into these posts, but that's also why they're popular.
Also, it's probably good if he's doing marketing. It's good advertising for his marketing prowess and ability, right?
I'm sure he gets a lot of job offers,
if he can make something really that dry stand out, that's a good example.
Yeah. Shane, I was thinking about your list, and it's funny how often Ted and I have talked in the last few weeks about the personal thing. Is there some of you in this post? How you said, could anybody have posted that? Or are you the only one that could have written that?
Mm-hmm.
I really love the stuff about advice, especially the I did instead of you should. I did advice is so much more interesting than you should advice, because it's so hard to put a filter on you should advice, right?
Yeah.
But another one, I'm thinking about I had Jason Fried on the podcast, and since then followed him incessantly on LinkedIn, right? And he draws a line in the sand. He's got a point of view, and he's not afraid of you not agreeing with him. He's very passionate. Hey, everybody's so worried about laying off employees. How come now he's talking about the wild overhiring in advance? And we built a company just as big as Monday and Asana with 10 times less staff. How about the upfront discipline? And it's ooh, that's generally this is not just puppies and roses, right? But I find by following his stuff over and over, or Mark Randolph, founder of Netflix, with Reed Hastings, his post this yesterday was don't follow me on social media. And it's this whole big thing about how like social media got away from him, ended up not being that healthy. And so his message is like, don't follow me if this is not healthy for you. But here's what it did well for me. Here's what it did bad for me. Here's my happy medium I've gotten to, you know? And it's not just like, it wasn't just some platitude, right? Anyways,
I like
any thoughts on like taking a stand or like, you know, preaching the gospel on something?
I think that anytime you can be contrarian and actually mean it is great. Because I mean, Jason Fried, I really respect how he and his whole company, you know, they do that. We're not for everyone, you know, but if what we're saying sounds like you, then this is for you, you know, and I really respect that. And so it, you know, the contrarian or the counterintuitive thing, you can seek that, and not just to be a troll, but a subset of the world that will be exactly what they need to hear, or, you know, or want to hear, and that stands out. Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of my writing in the past was driven by what is the thing about this topic, by this question, what is the thing about this topic that I can say that is contrary to the popular belief? You know, I spent a lot of time kind of railing on, you know, business research in the 80s and 90s that, you know, told us to do X, Y, or Z. Like the one I rail on probably the most is that being happy at work and fitting the culture at work is not conducive to innovation. That all these research studies said that, you know, companies where people were like their coworkers and could talk about things and fit in and, you know, and fit the mold, were companies where people were happiest. But then you layer on companies that also are the first to develop new products and invent things and first to market and beat other companies and, you know, not have blind spots. Those things don't necessarily go together. A lot of that, like, oh, hey, we all love the same things and we're all happy and nice to each other, means you're not having hard conversations or you're not pushing boundaries. On the other side of that, of course, people who are jerks to each other and not supporting each other, that also doesn't work. But a lot of the point is that a lot of the things that I've found with counterintuitive or contrarian advice is picking apart old things that you know, that we've kind of taken the wrong lesson away from research or from, you know, old stories, and that's just been a go-to of mine. So instead of culture fit, culture add, you know, and it's like, oh yeah, once you read that or you hear that, you're like, of course, that sounds like good advice. Like, it sounds obvious in retrospect, but until you hear it, it's not necessarily obvious. And so that's, I think, an angle you can kind of search for.
Yeah. I know we're winding down for time here. Ted, why don't you ask our last question?
I guess, Shane, you mentioned that you got into this early. It seems to me that, you know, LinkedIn has hit 1 billion users. I mean, my theory of this about LinkedIn is it's now becoming an identification platform where people look you up there. So it's beyond a job networking site. It's beyond actually even content and social. It's like now where people look you up to see if you are who you are, and so forth. So that said, I think everybody's going to have to participate, whether they kind of like this or not. You know, they're going to have to, because they're going to be judged on their profile. And obviously some of the stuff's easy, but the content is kind of the hardest nut to crack there. What would be your advice to people who are the reluctant participants?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, okay, I realize I have to do something here. I've got to show up. It's almost like the people who don't like to speak publicly, but they know they have to speak publicly. Okay. So I think that's where we are with LinkedIn. Even if you kind of hate the idea, you don't want your profile to be empty. What should those people do?
Yeah, I would say there's two things. One is sort of the kick in the pants, and then the other is the sort of the carrot. There was a point in time where it became clear that if you did not have a website as a business, you did not exist. Right. And we're kind of at that point in time when it comes to LinkedIn. If you do not have a profile that shows what you're about, it's really hard to more or less, you know, be seen as existing in a, you know, and maybe there's some contrarian, counterpoint to that. But really the carrot, I would say, is if in this era where we look up everything, we decide who we're going to do business with before we even reach out to them, right? We're researching the companies we want to work with. We're researching the people that we want to get the intros to before we get those intros. All things being equal, the person who you feel like you know better, or you feel like you understand what their values are, whether they're the same values as yours or not, if you feel like that, you're going to be more likely to want to do business with them than the person who has no photo and no posts, and you don't really know what you're getting into if you decide that you go into business with them or you want to go out on a limb with them. And I think that's the value there. Like sharing your stories or helping people get insight into what you care about and what you're an expert on is going to make the difference between people coming to you to want to do business and not, because your competitors are doing that. And if they show up and you don't show up, that might make the entire difference.
That's well said. Yeah.
Shane, thank you so much for making time, especially with zero notice. Open mic here. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to leave people with on this subject or any other subject?
Well, I want to say, thank you for having me on. I am interested in the rest of this series that y'all are doing, because this is something that I am, by no means the world's greatest expert on this. I have my slice of experience that I can share, but I'm excited because it's always evolving, and it's all about getting better and learning from each other. So I'll say that I think this is exciting that you guys are doing this. And I guess like the point that I am happiest to have gotten to share is this one about the mentorship from afar, seeing both your role as someone who's sharing content and creating content, on LinkedIn, as someone who could be that mentor from afar for other people at every part of their career. There's people that are joining this platform, and they'll see your stuff, and they'll see that you have a lot to offer, and that's worth a lot. But also look at the people who you would want to have as your mentor, no matter where you are in your career. See what they're posting, and that could be inspiring for how you can do the content that you want to do.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about the best places for people to follow you, buy the books, subscribe to your newsletter, buy virtual production. Tell me where people should be going on the internet.
Yeah. So shanesnow.com has, when you click on, it has my LinkedIn link right there, and it's a link to my posts, my content, not to my profile, actually. So that's where you can see some of my past stuff. There's links to my companies and books as well. So that's the easiest place to find me.
I love it. Thanks again for doing this.
Yeah. Thanks. Great talking to you guys. And like I said, I look forward to the rest of the series.
Yeah. So everyone, we are planning on doing this Thought Leadership for CEOs series, ideally weekly. So tune in. Ted's got a whole list of interesting people for us to talk to. And thanks for tuning in. Bye.